Good evening and welcome. I'm Fadi Nassar, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute, and I'll be moderating today's discussion, graciously hosted by Kulluna Irada. We're gathering at a time when the Middle East is being shaped in real time by conflict, diplomacy, and deep uncertainty. It's the kind of moment that demands nuance, candor, and expertise, and that's exactly what we have with us today. I'm joined by two deeply respected voices in the field, Emile Hokayem, Director of Regional Security and Senior Fellow for Middle East Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and Gregg Carlstrom, Middle East Correspondent for The Economist. Their work has helped decision makers, analysts, and the public make sense of some of the region's most difficult questions. And tonight, they're here to help us do the same. Emile, Gregg, thank you for being here. Now, Gregg, you opened your foreign affairs piece last March with a powerful line that's really stayed with me. You wrote, "Wars can clarify and wars can confuse." So let me start today's conversation by revisiting those words. More than a year later, and a new round of conflict, have the lines become any clearer, or are we sinking further into the fog?
Good question. I forgot that I wrote those words, actually. I forgot that I wrote that piece. It feels like a lifetime ago at this point. Thank you for having me. Thanks for the invitation, and thank you for hosting this. I think coming out of this most recent round of conflict between Israel and Iran, I think in the short term, everyone can argue that they got what they wanted out of this war. Everyone can almost claim victory. The Israelis certainly can claim to have done meaningful damage to Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile program, and they have, beyond that, I think perhaps more importantly in the long term, broken the taboo on overt military action against Iran, and not only that, but enlisted the United States in that effort. At the same time, the Iranians can say they survived. The regime endured, it made it through the war, obviously weakened, battered, but it survived the conflict. The Americans can say they avoided the sort of worst case scenario of America being drawn into a forever war, America sending troops. Donald Trump was able to drop his big bombs on Iran without provoking the worst case scenario feared by many Americans, including many members of his base. And Arab states, Gulf states in particular, can say they made it through the conflict without their own doomsday scenario. There was a symbolic Iranian retaliation on Al Udeid air base in Qatar, but we didn't see a larger, more substantial Iranian attack on countries in the Gulf. So everyone can claim, again, to have sort of achieved their core goal during this 12-day war. I think the question going forward is, can any of them sustain those accomplishments? Can any of them in 6 months' time, in a year's time, say that they continue to have achieved those goals? And I think that's where this probably confuses more than it clarifies, at least in the short term. At what point will Iran decide to make a push for a nuclear weapon? Will it decide to break out, to cross the threshold, not just be a nuclear threshold state, but actually try to develop a nuclear weapon? What sorts of capabilities does it still have to do that? Where is its highly enriched uranium? How many centrifuges might it have hidden away at a facility that wasn't targeted? Can Israel sustain the sort of ongoing military operations in Iran that we've seen it sustain in Lebanon since the end of the war here in November, or in Syria since the fall of the Assad regime in December? We don't know the answers to these longer term questions. So I think as dramatic as those 12 days were, in the short term, they're very inconclusive.
Well, thank you, Gregg. I want to sort of then redirect the question, but try and get into the nitty-gritty here with you, Emile. How would you describe the regional security equation right now? We've seen a multi-front conflict unfold since October 7th. Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and now direct strikes, as we just heard from Gregg, on Iranian nuclear facilities. From where you sit, how do all these fronts connect, and what kind of regional order or disorder are we looking at?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. First, let me echo what Greg just said. I agree that in the medium and long term, this war looks inconclusive, or these sets of wars. We haven't reached an equilibrium yet. So to address your question more directly, the military balance of power has definitely shifted in the region. I mean, we saw the crumbling of Iran's deterrent strategy, and we can talk about it in detail. That certainly affects Lebanon and Syria, but not only. Israel's air superiority is clear to everyone. The tempo of operation, the sophistication of the air campaign, there's no other regional force that can do that. I would argue that most Western air forces could not have pulled off from a purely operational perspective what they did. And Israel is really far ahead from all its regional competitors at this point. They will have options. They will think about their own conventional deterrent strategies and so on. But we saw a real display of military prowess. At the same time, the military picture doesn't tell the whole story. I mean, I work at an institute that publishes an annual review called the Military Balance, where we count tanks and missiles and so on. So I would know something about this stuff. But if you stop at military assessments, you actually miss much of the picture. So today, yes, we are moving towards an era of Israeli military dominance in the region. Dominance is not hegemony. Hegemony, the technical definition is domination by consent. I don't think there's much consent for that in the region. And actually, there's a lot of apprehension. Because first, what that new military balance suggests, associated with Israel's current mindset, is that we're in for several cycles or several rounds of conflict. Iran's nuclear program has been significantly weakened, but there is just as much, if not more, ambiguity about that program now than there was in the past. Iran's relations with its network of militia partners in the region has been weakened. I would argue, and we can talk about this in detail later, that there's actually a loss of confidence, of trust within that network. But these organizations haven't disappeared. They will, some of them, will say, why did we invest so much time in state building, where actually what we should have done is focus on our military security ethos, which can reveal itself through guerrilla movement, not just or even terrorist activity as well. So this is not the end of the story, but importantly, the various state actors that exist in the region, the Gulf states, Turkey, Egypt, etc., look at all this with a lot of concern. They don't like it when they see an Israel that is that powerful, but at the same time has no political vision, doesn't engage in any kind of serious diplomatic outreach, and is expansionist, because that's what it is today. They don't like that. They are quite wary about the US. And the Gulf states, for instance, had hoped that after Trump's visit to the region in May, they had reached some kind of understanding about what the real priorities were in the region. I mean, Trump gave this very significant speech, that Greg covered in May in Riyadh, saying the era of intervention and so on is over. The way they interpret it is that we're not going to have wars and we can focus on our economic and geoeconomic agendas. Well, just a month later, you have a quite significant war, and that's not the end of it. I would argue. So they're not pleased with this. Now, they'll have to, sorry for the expression, suck it up. They're going to have to accept a lot of these transformations. They'll have to adjust to them, but it doesn't mean that they're doing it without any agency. It doesn't mean that they're going to do it while accepting everything that Tel Aviv or Washington ask from them. So, I would be very careful not to mistake military dominance for some kind of new stability.
Certainly, and I want to stay with you just for a moment, Emile. Iran has long relied on three main levers to project power in the region: its nuclear program, its proxies, and its growing arsenal of missiles and drones. In your recent Financial Times piece, you made a pretty novel and important argument, one I haven't heard really, I would even argue it challenges the status quo. You argue that after the military blows it's taken, Tehran is likely to focus on one remaining lever: short-range, precise, and plentiful missile and drone systems that are essentially mostly effective within the Gulf. That's a serious potential shift. Can you walk us through your assessment, and what would such a focus really tell us about where you see Iran assessing its power and its limits right now?
Certainly, I mean, Iran's security strategy has been shattered. There's no other way to put it. The nuclear program was for Iran a way to engage with great powers, sit with the Chinese and the Russians and the Europeans and the Americans and tell the region, look, we play with the big guys. We want to get benefits. There was ambiguity around the nuclear program because of that. And so Iran derived some standing from that international diplomacy. They liked it, this is what we discuss with the big guys. You in the region, you don't have a seat at the table. The missiles and the UAVs, I mean, when you say missiles, both cruise missiles and especially ballistic missiles, that was part of a strategy of deterrence, right? And deterrence by punishment, essentially. Those systems were plentiful, they were diverse, and so on. It turns out they weren't accurate enough. They struggled against advanced air defenses, and Israel does have a pretty impressive array of air defenses. They struggled. They struggled to achieve military results, strategic results in April, in October, and then again during this last round in June. And then there's the militias. The militias it's an array. I don't call them proxy. But they were essentially meant to deter. They were meant to deter Israel from going after Iran's territory, Iran's leadership, Iran's critical facilities. Well, Israel went after the territory, the leadership, and the facilities. And the militias, as we saw in Lebanon and elsewhere, were just simply not ready for that kind of high intensity attrition war that we saw. I would argue that, and I would, go a step further. I would say, if you are sitting in Iran today and you're part of the IRGC and you're asking yourself what went wrong, you may actually be a bit angry at Qasem Soleimani for overstating and overselling the deterrent power of the militia network. That Iran invested way too much in these things, contrary to pure defense, which they did in the past few years, but it was not nearly enough. So we'll see what happens within Iran, the strategic thinking that goes in. My point is that if Iran today wants to continue being a strategic actor, and it cannot project force far away or with effectiveness against Israel and so on, it's going to have to think about whether it wants to accommodate its neighbors, to try to have its neighbors on side, so that they are part of Iran's diplomatic strategy, diplomatic outreach, or whether it will say, you know what, if we see an existential threat to us, well, perhaps we demonstrate that we can disrupt the region, and that will have a consequence for global stability, global economic stability, and so on. And Iran has still probably around 1,500 short-range ballistic missiles. These are very useful against the Gulf states, against infrastructure. They have UAVs and so on. I'm not predicting. I'm not saying this is what they're going to do. I'm just saying this is what's really left in the arsenal. And so Iran is facing a very difficult decision if the US and Israel after some the next diplomatic process goes awry, whether they have to show some teeth, and that's the one thing they can do.
No, very thoughtful, Emile. Thank you. And Greg, building off what we just heard, what does the future of the axis of resistance look like to you?
I think I agree with Emile. I think Iran is probably going to go through a process of reassessing the utility of that axis, whether it even was asking whether it was a coherent axis to begin with. But I think break it down into its constituent parts. What do the futures of those parts look like? I think Hamas as an entity in Gaza, something called Hamas will continue when the war is over, whenever Israel's war in Gaza ends. But it is not going to be a strategic actor in the sense of being able to threaten Israel, certainly not the way it did on October 7th, but even not in the years before that, where it could periodically muster an arsenal of thousands of short-range rockets and fire them at Israeli cities and cause temporary disruptions to daily life. It won't even be able to do that. It will probably have some cells that it can call on in the occupied West Bank to carry out attacks there. But I think it's going to be a very long time, if ever, before Hamas is able to pose a sort of coherent strategic threat to Israel. So it is not a useful part of the axis of resistance going forward. I think Hezbollah in Lebanon, I mean, we can talk about that at much greater length, I'm sure, later on in the webinar. But I think it has a decision to make internally right now, and obviously, from what we are all hearing, there are divergent views within Hezbollah about what its future should look like, how much of its arsenal it should be prepared to hand over to the Lebanese state, how much it should be prepared to sort of accept the sovereignty of the Lebanese state. And that process is going to go on for a while. And Lebanon will have some say in that process. That will not be an entirely, I think, Iranian process that is dictated from Tehran. I think Hezbollah and the Lebanese state will both have some say in that. I think trying to rearm Hezbollah through Syria will be extremely difficult for Iran going forward. I am sure that it will try to find partners to work with in Syria, groups that are frustrated with the fall of the Assad regime, frustrated with Ahmed Shara's government. It will try to find partners, but it is just going to be much, much harder to operate in Syria the way that Iran did. And I think we shouldn't discount the gravity of the change there. And I think that really leaves Iran with two partners that it can rely on. The Houthis in Yemen, who have been a problematic partner historically, who are, I think, quite independently minded, who are not a proxy in the sense of having direct command and control from Tehran. They have clearly demonstrated that they can cause havoc to global shipping, as they are doing again this week, targeting two commercial ships in the Red Sea. They have proven themselves to be a nuisance or a danger to Israel, not a strategic threat to Israel. They are too far away. Their arsenal of long-range drones and missiles is too limited to saturate Israeli cities the way Hamas or Hezbollah could have. But they can pose a nuisance and a minor danger to Israel. But I think particularly given what they can do in the Red Sea and given their proximity to Saudi Arabia, to the Emirates, to the Gulf states, that makes them useful for the Iranians going forward. And then you have the militias in Iraq, which obviously are the most extensive of Iran's proxies, I think, both in size, in men-at-arms, and in their connections with the degree to which they are intertwined with the Iraqi state. I think it's been striking over the past 2 years how much those proxies have been able to sit out this regional war, how much Iraq has been insulated from the conflict that we have seen spread across the Middle East. On some level, I think that reflects a decision by these militias in Iraq to try and keep themselves out of it, at least for some of these militias. But I think also it might reflect an Iranian decision that at the end of the day, Iraq is their strategic depth. Iraq is the one country where they really cannot afford to have a major Israeli campaign, American campaign, where they cannot risk their proxies, because that really is their strategic depth. And so I think they will try to keep obviously their linkages with various militias in Iraq, but whether they will deploy them to strategic ends, to attack Israel, to attack Gulf states, I think they might be more reluctant to do that than they have been with some of their other partners in the region.
Thank you. That was a great bird's eye view. I want to open this next question to both of you. And it's, we have an audience that is largely Lebanese today. And this is a question I think on most people's minds. What does all of this mean? What you're saying, what Emile just told us earlier about the future of Hezbollah. But I thought a way maybe we can constructively engage with that question in a bit of a different take is, you're both such experienced analysts. You've been on the field. You've been covering these issues for so long. You're talking, I'll speak for myself, a far simpler mind. So could you walk me through the different scenarios you see for Hezbollah in the next year? What does the next year look like? Maybe we can start with you, Greg, since you just kicked it off.
Sure. Different scenarios for the next year. I mean, there is, of course, the sort of best case scenario in which Hezbollah decides that its future looks not unlike the path that other militias / political parties in Lebanon have traveled over the years, which is to hand over the bulk of your arms to the state, probably keep some light arms, but hand over the bulk of them to the state, accept the sovereignty of the Lebanese state and the Lebanese army. And in return for that, you have an assured place in the political system. I think I'm reading between the lines a bit here, but some of the messaging coming out of Washington in recent days and recent weeks, coming from Tam Barak when he was here, it is almost like, look at what happened with Ahmed Shara in Syria, look at what happened with HTS in Syria, look at how America has, over the past 6 or 7 months, been willing to recognize these groups as legitimate political actors, remove sanctions on the Syrian state and on HTS in particular. Barak, when he was here in Lebanon this week, was sort of at pains to reiterate that Hezbollah is a political party. He said, for America, of course, it is a foreign terrorist organization. For much of the world, it is a foreign terrorist organization. But here in Lebanon, it is a political party. And he brought up the example of HTS. And so there is perhaps a path there for Hezbollah. I don't think it's going to walk that path, though. I don't think it's going to do that. You have, I think, the worst case scenario, which is that it refuses to hand over anything, that it insists on, sort of keeping sophisticated military capabilities, the ones that it can use to menace Israel, and that at some point, Israel loses patience with the Lebanese president, the Lebanese army. So far, I think the view in Israel is fairly positive about what it has seen in terms of disarmament, in terms of the Lebanese army trying to exert its authority south of the Litani. People in Israel who are not normally very positive or very upbeat about Lebanon have been saying sort of encouraging things in recent months. So I think generally they are fine with the status quo for now, and they are willing to give the Lebanese government time to do its work, but that time won't be open-ended. And so I do think at some point there is a risk that the war resumes. And then I think in between those poles, you have what is probably a more realistic middle ground of Hezbollah does enough in terms of handing over some weapons, relinquishing some positions south of the Litani to satisfy the Israelis for now, to satisfy the Americans for now, but it tries to buy time, it tries to stall, and it tries to hope that at some point circumstances in Lebanon or circumstances in the region will change in its favor. Maybe the elections next year will produce a government that is less inclined to try and restrain Hezbollah. Maybe Iran will somehow bounce back and find a way to strengthen itself. Maybe things will change in Syria. Who knows? But I think we've seen on everything in Lebanon in recent years, delay and procrastination is sort of a national pastime for political leaders. And I think Hezbollah, I wouldn't be surprised if it tries to do the same when it comes to the question of its weapons.
Emile, I wanted to thank you, Greg. I want to turn to you. You and Greg have been in agreement for most of this discussion, so I need to find creative ways to bring some differing perspectives. One thing we didn't hear is how the Iranians are looking at this in that scenario. What's the utility of Hezbollah for them in this moment, and how does that affect the scenario planning you see?
Yeah. I think Greg earlier made an important point, which is in the past, when we discussed the future of Hezbollah, the consensus was that it would be decided in Tehran. I think that has shifted significantly. I think it's no longer, the answer is not just in Tehran anymore. It is in Beirut to a large extent. It is in Dahiya to a large extent. It's not just it used to be a question of strategic importance for Tehran. And what I referred to earlier about this debate in Iran about the future defense posture is going to be critical. Try to look at it. Let's engage in an exercise of strategic empathy. Try to put yourself in Iranian shoes. That conflict that started on the 7th of October was launched by a partner that sat at the outer edge of your axis, and over time drew in, and the Iranians, there's still no evidence that the Iranians knew about the timing, the type of action with all its atrocities, the ambition that Hamas had, and so on. I mean, I'm still want to be convinced that the Iranians, I will look at any evidence, but as far as I can see, they may have agreed, theoretically on something at one point, how do we do cross-border operations? But that was a different level altogether. So if you're in Iran, you're like, okay, these guys dragged us into a conflict, which ended up exposing our partners who did not know how to stay on the escalation ladder all along. Hezbollah was trying to find a role for itself. If anything, it would have settled for almost anything, after the 7th of October. Give us anything so there is a ceasefire in Gaza, even, a cosmetic one, so we can sign off this conflict, because I'm not convinced they were in it altogether, right? They wanted to minimize their exposure to extent. And then you lose Hezbollah, and then not because Israel really wanted it, but you lose Syria as well, and then the war comes to you at home. And so from that perspective, those partners have exposed you. Everything you wanted was to protect your territory, your leadership, and your critical infrastructure from the Israelis. You ended up losing those partners and suffering severe blows. So if you're going to sit down in Tehran and think about your defense strategy, you're going to have to think hard about whether those partners expose you or protect you. So that's number one. The second point in this relationship is, I would argue, a loss of trust and confidence within the network. We have not seen the kind of strategic or operational alignment and coordination that these guys said they were engaged in when they celebrated a few weeks before the 7th of October, their newly set up operations room, that we as analysts, believed had more substance than it ended up having. Those people like me and others had also overestimated the power of the network. I would argue we still believe that Israel was the powerful military force. We just didn't expect, just to be fully honest, I did expect this outcome in Lebanon, but I thought that the high intensity war would last 3 to 6 months, not a month and a half, right? I mean, that's where we as analysts, as outsiders, we got it wrong. But the point from the Iranians is that they could never meet the expectations of their partners. Their partners sought operational strategic guidance or operational help from the Iranians that never came. So there is a real moment of doubt in this access. And so if you're Iran, you're gonna think, okay, if I have a limited amount of resources to spend on all that, what do I really spend it on militias? Or do I invest in air defenses or on more sensors or on conventional deterrence? Things that perhaps I can control. When I say conventional deterrence, I certainly include more missiles. I certainly think that if the Iranians are given the choice between dropping a group in Syria or Lebanon and more accurate ballistic missiles, medium and short range, if I were Iranian, I would go for missiles. That's something I control, however exposed it is. But we're at the very beginning of that process in Tehran, and it's going to be an ugly one. Yes, the regime right now in Iran is focused on consolidating its power, but within the IRGC, you will have pretty tough discussions about what went wrong. You will have also tough discussions between the IRGC and the conventional military, and you will have also a lot of criticism of the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who has been seen as too cautious, too fearful, as having self-deterred essentially all along, including on the nuclear issue. So again, what's going to happen in Iran is going to have a big impact in Lebanon, in Syria, elsewhere. But I would argue we're at the beginning of that, very difficult process of facing up to everything that went wrong.
Right. And, thank you, Emile. I want to, build off what you both said, but since, just building off the momentum of what you said, Emile, and to sort of remedy some of the, how did you frame it? Not what you got wrong, but what you didn't get fully correct. I want to shine a light on your predictive instincts. You foresaw the risk of an Israel-Iran confrontation well before it hit the headlines. So I want to ask again a question that is on the minds of investors, of people living in the country, with regular Israeli strikes in Lebanon and Hezbollah's leadership issuing defiant messages that challenge the government's claim to a monopoly on force. And everything we just heard from Gregg's, different scenarios. How do you read the terrain today? And how likely is an Israeli escalation against Hezbollah?
So forgive my bad sense of humor in difficult moments like this, but if I were good at prediction, I would be talking to you from my yacht in, some beautiful place, and I don't think that looks like the background of a yacht. So the point is, our job is to identify the structural trends, the dynamics, and at a time where the president of the United States is Donald Trump, and that's like in a way a key ingredient. We have to be very careful about what we foresee. That said, the way I see it is that this is where I'm a bit not in agreement with Gregg. I think in Israel, they look at Lebanon and they still see a window of opportunity to operate. I think they think that there's a lot more that can be done. The structure of that ceasefire works for them in a way because it essentially legitimizes, at least from their perspective, constant attacks. The French who got themselves included are pretty sidelined. You will have noted that in Tom Barrack's interview on LBCI yesterday, at one point he takes a dig at the French when he said, well, they don't recognize Hezbollah as a terrorist group, everyone else. I think that was a calculated peak at this. So in a way, they feel the Americans are in charge of the agenda. They can create the space. If the Lebanese government is not responsive to American demands, it essentially allows the Israelis to do what they want. So I do see a potential for an Israeli led escalation. I still think that Hezbollah is unlikely to initiate something big because of a number of factors. First, they're trying to regroup. It's not just about capabilities here and there. It's about having a concept of what you want to achieve, what you can achieve, and I think they're very far from that. Second, they're very worried that if they do something, it's going to fuel more domestic criticism, and there's plenty of it these days. And they've noted that a number of their Christian partners, Sunni partners, and so on, have essentially dropped them, because of that war. Also because they, Hassan Nasrallah said, "Don't worry, guys. I understand the enemy. I understand the risk appetite. I will not risk a total war." And guess what? He got it wrong and militarily underperformed. So that suddenly Hezbollah is much less, looks a lot less mighty in saying. So, it is more exposed to domestic criticism. You promised us that you can achieve big things. You couldn't. So, what are you? And then there is also the fact that we're getting close to elections in Lebanon, and whatever you do is going to have an impact on the elections, and you can see a quite detrimental impact for Hezbollah, not necessarily within its constituency, but with other constituencies if it jumps into that. So I think Hezbollah is still quite restrained. I think Israel looks at it primarily through the window of operational opportunity.
No,
If there are things it can achieve militarily at this point, it will do it. That's it. I think it comes down to that. And that suggests that there will be more. I mean, we saw in the past 48 hours greater military activity in the south, more bombing and so on. I mean, when I tell my Western interlocutors how many violations of the ceasefire there have been since November, December, it's huge, but it doesn't register. And from Israel's perspective, it's good. It means that they can actually operate without much criticism and so on. I mean, this is not much on the radar internationally. I would say the other big thing to keep in mind is what happens to UNIFIL. That for me is a big one to keep in mind. Will the mandate be revised? Will the funding be affected? Will the Americans and the Israelis manage to change something to that force? It could be killed altogether, or it could be reformed or readjusted to meet specific needs by the Americans or the Israelis.
Thank you. So that's I want to just give an opportunity, Greg, to build off of what you just heard. And then I'll ask you in just a few sentences if you want to build off what, since you were directly engaged.
I think when it comes to what Israel is going to do, there's also a political element in Israel that we can't get around. I mean, there is a big question right now about, is Netanyahu, off the back of the war in Iran, which has buoyed him in the polls a little bit, not as much as he would have hoped, but it's helped him a little bit. Is he looking to call a snap election in the next couple of months to try and reconfigure his coalition? I think the consequences of that are going to be greater for the war in Gaza than for the future of conflict in Lebanon, but I think it's relevant to Lebanon as well. If Netanyahu is thinking about going for an election, that probably will be a constraint, at least for a few months, on what Israel can or cannot do operationally in Lebanon.
Thank you, Greg. And, I want to build off something you were talking about, and then I want to give time for questions from the public. And I remind everyone, just type your questions in the chat and I'll be sure to raise them. There's something we haven't spoken about, and it's the Trump factor. You mentioned that there is a penchant among Lebanon's leadership to delay, to defer. And we heard, right, from US Ambassador Barak, that Washington has great attention for a small country like Lebanon and is willing, in his words, and a new president who is willing to give Lebanon the attention it deserves, but there's a short attention span for the country. So how does that affect the next steps for you? Again, I want to just try and bring it a bit. I know it's always difficult to ask, but in the next 6 months, what does the US-Lebanon relationship look like for you?
I think one thing that makes it very difficult to assess is that there just is not a policy process in this administration the way that you normally would have with any other American president. I mean, if you take American policy in Lebanon, what does America want to see? Forget Hezbollah for a minute, forget security issues. What about economic reform and an IMF deal? We heard Morgan Ortegas, the previous envoy here in May at a forum in Qatar, basically said, maybe Lebanon doesn't need an IMF deal. Maybe we can forget this whole idea of an IMF agreement. That was her position 2 months ago. Tom Barak was here this week. He had a roundtable for a few journalists at the airport on Tuesday, just before he left. So a few of us spent about 45 minutes with him before he left Lebanon. His position is very much that Lebanon needs an IMF deal, that Lebanon needs to implement the sorts of economic reforms, bank restructuring, the gap law, things like that, that might unlock this long delayed IMF deal. That's Tom Barak's position. What is Donald Trump's position on this? What is the administration's official position on this or on so many other things? We really don't know. We thought back in February that his position on the Gaza war was he wanted it to end. And then at a press conference with Netanyahu, he stood up in the White House and announced that America's policy was to ethnically cleanse Gaza and turn it into a beach resort. So we really don't know American policy on a lot of things. But I think when it comes to Lebanon, I mean, one thing that I find striking about what Barak said this week, both in public and in private, was America does not seem to be offering Lebanon guarantees around Israeli territorial withdrawal from the 5 points in the south. It's not offering guarantees about the ceasefire, about actually implementing a ceasefire in which Israel ceases fire in Lebanon. It's not offering to constrain or alter Israeli behavior in any meaningful way. It's trying to offer other things. It's offering the prospect of money for reconstruction in the south. Barak earlier this week said, according to him, Saudi Arabia and Qatar have pledged some money for specific reconstruction projects in the south. That money would be unlocked, he said, if there is sufficient progress on implementing the ceasefire, on the LAF taking control south of the Litani. He wouldn't say how much money, but he said that would happen regardless of whether or not there was an IMF deal or economic reforms. That money, that reconstruction money was just connected to the question of security and Hezbollah's arms. So America is offering those sorts of things, and it's not offering them directly. American officials are at pains to say, we're not doing nation building, we're not looking to put money into this ourselves, but they are offering to facilitate, donations by Gulf countries and those sorts of incentives. But again, they're not offering any real promises around what Israel will or will not do.
Well, thank you both.
Can I just add one thing? What Greg said at the beginning is very important for Lebanese audiences to pay attention to. So Morgan Ortegas arrives and everything is around her, and everyone in Beirut is trying to decipher the meaning of this sentence or whatever they say. But she didn't have a strategy, she didn't have a staff. It was just about the networking and same thing with Tom Barak. Obviously, he plays at a more senior role because of who he is, how wealthy he is, how directly connected with Trump he is, and so on. But he doesn't have much staff. He is not. He's not developing, complex positions, and he's not representing a government that is willing to deploy tools, etc. I mean, the U.S. government just got rid of USAID. If you want to help Lebanon, there are probably some expertise and some things that could have come from there. Well, this is off and that's the point to understand, is that this new America is not the one that will necessarily support a long-term process, well-designed, working with the World Bank, the IMF at every turn, and so on. It's not interested in this kind of approach, the one that we got used to. And I'm not necessarily saying it was the right approach. I'm just saying that the way they view their interactions with these countries is completely different, and it can change just like that. I mean, the Americans and Tom Barak are making a major bet right now on Syria in particular. You know what? Happen to think that's the right way to go at this point. But if it doesn't work because Syria becomes too unstable for whatever reason and so on, then that bet can just vanish like that. And you never know. Tom Barak may lose his job over that because he's the one carrying it. I'm on this issue, I'm rooting for him because we really want a stable Syria. But what I'm trying to say is that you can't assume that these things are institutionally on track and that there is a buy-in from everyone who matters, and that all the regional partners have full understanding, full clarity of what's happening, what is their exposure, what is their role in it.
No, I take note. Actually, you both lead me to my last question, and then and this is my last effort to engage our audience to keep typing their questions. We're going to get through them. Geopolitics is often framed as a contest between states and forces, but arguably at its core, it's shaped by the decisions of individuals, each with their own experiences, fears, and ambitions. And I want to turn this question to both of you in different ways. Gregg, Iran's supreme leader, now deep into his 80s, leads amid serious military setbacks that we talked about, and something we didn't really is a wave of high-profile assassinations. And something you hinted to is that Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, navigates his own labyrinth of challenges, but also strategic openings. So, Gregg, how do you think these two men are reading the regional chessboard today? Just important for our own conversation. Tie it to Lebanon. What are the risks when their perceptions and their ambitions clash? But Emile, just since we're on this thread, I want you please to zoom in on Lebanon's leadership. We didn't talk about them, and especially the key power players, the president, the prime minister, and the speaker of parliament. After Ambassador Barak's visit and everything we just talked about, what's your take on how they're reading Lebanon's crossroads? How do you think their distinct strategic mindsets will shape the country's future? Maybe we start with you, Gregg.
Sure. I think on both of those men, Khamenei and Netanyahu, I think you can ask whether they are constitutionally, ideologically, intellectually capable of navigating what is a very different region today than it was 2 years ago. You look at Khamenei, I mean, this is someone who, like so many Iranian officials, right, sort of came of age politically during the Iran-Iraq War. He was the president of Iran at that time, back in the 80s, and became supreme leader shortly after the war ended. And that has shaped so much of his tenure as Iran's supreme leader, from pushing for this strategy of forward defense, of proxy militias across the region, of trying to keep conflicts away from Iran's borders, obviously born out of that experience of the Iran-Iraq War. His approach to the West, his suspicion of the West, born out of Western support for Saddam Hussein during the war in the 1980s. So much of his worldview was shaped by that war. And I think also the way he is acting now internally in Iran, the way the regime has made this sort of very striking, very abrupt pivot to try and co-opt nationalism, nationalist songs, nationalist symbolism, the billboards that are going up around Tehran of pre-Islamic Iranian figures, something that this regime would never have done a few weeks ago, trying to use this war to rally the public around the flag, much as the Islamic Republic was able to do in its early days in the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War. But I think this is a very different moment for Iran, right? I think the public reaction to the Iran-Iraq War, which was an existential conflict sort of forced on Iran by its neighbor, I think the reaction to that internally is going to be very different than the reaction to what is basically a war of choice now for Iran, that was born from this regime deciding for decades to back a strategy of arming proxy militias, pursuing conflict with Israel, conflict with America. A humiliation in a war of choice plays out differently than a sort of bloody existential war that's forced on you. So I'm not sure Khamenei is going to be the man to update Iran's security doctrine for a changed Middle East, and I'm not sure that he is the man to try and navigate this very complicated moment domestically. And then I think you can say something very similar about Netanyahu. This is a prime minister who, for the entirety of his political career, has tried to foreclose the possibility of a Palestinian state. That has really been his life's work. A bit later in his career, he came to seeing Iran, of course, as an existential threat, and he made strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, his mission. But even before that, what Netanyahu really wanted to do was make sure there was never going to be a Palestinian state. He is, an adherent of sort of Jabotinsky style iron wall Likud ideology. His father very much came from that ideological milieu and passed that on to his son. You have a moment now in the Middle East where Israel has demonstrated its strength to everyone, and where there is an opportunity for Israel to pivot and for Israel to pursue diplomatic agreements. But as Emile said earlier, Israel is not offering anything. Israel is not offering any diplomatic vision, any diplomatic solution, not for the Palestinians and not really for the region more broadly. So Netanyahu, having asserted Israel's strength, is he the man who is ideologically or politically capable of leading Israel to diplomatic agreements? I'm not sure that he's that man.
Thanks, Greg. Emile, what are your thoughts on our Lebanese leadership?
Well, probably can't tell me more. I sit in London and I'm trying to figure out if Macron and Starmer, who had just a love fest the past couple of days, can survive their own political the headwinds here. Look, the Lebanese leaders are always faced with the same set of domestic considerations. They're always triangulating. You always need some ally who is actually a rival for whatever reason. You operate with limited resources. You're always worried that your rival within your own community is going to outflank you, etc., etc. So beyond, and then there's the issues of economic power, military power, ability. I mean, just and just sheer courage. This moment requires a certain amount of courage that I'm not sure our leaders are necessarily capable of. I think the Tom Barak came with a very strong message. I would almost call it an ultimatum. He wasn't making threats, but he was saying, if you don't move very quickly, you're going to lose all these things. He's not saying if you don't move quickly, we're going to come hard on you and punish you. We're just going to say, well, you know what? Things are moving, and too bad for you. Don't expect us to come back to you in a year or so, because if inertia is what defines the Lebanese political system, then it's really not it's no longer going to work. Importantly, I would say is the Saudis seems to be on the same line, or probably have an even harder position than the Americans on Lebanon, and the ones trying to have a soft to promote a softer approach are the French, but they're quite isolated. So it's not as if the Lebanese leaders can go to one country to balance the demand of another. This is over. I think the second thing that has been quite disorienting for the Lebanese are the changes in Syria. Not only Assad fell in December, but then Ahmed al-Shara comes, and in Lebanon you could see, oh, perhaps actually it could work for us, because that new Syria is going to be still isolated under sanctions, which means that Lebanon is going to be the conduit to Syria, and our banks and our traders and so on can control or be involved in that trade. So we'll make some money out of it, and so on. And then you have suddenly the lifting of sanctions on Syria, and everyone is rushing, and Syria becomes the focus of all the political attention, and possibly economic ones. By the way, it may not work. And so then the Lebanese realize, oh, we may actually be left behind. Syria may not be this big boon, because the Syrians are going to develop their infrastructure. They'll figure out a way to fit in those new economic corridors. They'll be useful to the Turks and the Saudis. And by the way, the Americans are working well with both of them, and so on. So then the Lebanese are also like, okay, are we missing something? And I would say one of the, beyond the hard political security issues that we discussed about, the Lebanese have a responsibility to come up with joint project with the new Syria today. Yes, of course, we have to talk about border delineation, difficult political issues, and so on. But given the reduction of available funding for assistance investment, the fact that the Gulf states are not going to be, the naive, generous donors that they were in the past, but they will, attach more conditionality. They want to see returns. The Americans are cutting significantly. The Europeans have to fund Ukraine and their own defense spending and so on. They're basically saying, hey, Lebanon and Syria, can you come up with joint projects that make sense, so that, we don't see the Lebanese system yet producing, ideas or reconciling itself with a new Syria. So all this makes it very difficult for our political leaders to have like a strategic compass. I would go back to parochial Lebanese politics for a moment, but for me, there's, the game that is playing out is familiar and at the same time disappointing. What we have is a president who is outflanked to his right by his main Christian challenger, Samir Jaja, saying you're not tough enough and so on. So basically, you could argue that Samir Jaja is doing to Joseph Aoun what Michel Aoun did to Michel Sleiman, but from the left over a decade, 15 years ago. With Nawaf Salam, you also have, Sunni leaders who say, well, we need a stronger man at this time where the Lebanese presidency is asserting itself as, beyond the contours of Ta'if. And anyway, I mean, I've heard that from people I've interviewed. This is the Sunni moment again. So we need a strong Sunni leader who can talk to a strong Sunni leader in Syria and so on. So instead of talking about the much needed reform agenda, a sovereignty agenda that makes sense and resonates and so on, it's back to, what is the balance of power between the various communities and so on, which is really out of sync with what, external players expect.
Well, this is all excellent. Thank you both. And I want to open the floor now to the questions. And understandably, I think the vast majority of questions are about Hezbollah. And one common thread, right, that I see in all these questions, is a sense of what do you do? So you have this obstacle. You've both sort of presented that a job half done is no longer really an option or something that external actors are willing to accept, whether in terms of reinvesting in the country from the Gulf or Israel and allowing Hezbollah to regroup and rearm, right? And how it decides to deal with that, right? It has the option to do so. Okay, so if you had, I want to try and bring in the different questions. What is some advice you have for this government? Creative ways where it could show ownership over a Lebanese-led process, that it is a credible actor, that it's not simply a mediator between Hezbollah, Israel, and the United States. What's something it could do to restore trust that there is a peaceful path to disarm Hezbollah? Either one can go ahead.
I'm sure Gregg has the magic formula. Yeah. No, Gregg? Did I?
No, I do not. I wish I did.
So disappointed. It's just, I'm gonna, unsubscribe from the Economist. I thought all the answers were there. Look, I mean, first you need a demonstration of competence, and it doesn't have to be just on the matter of Hezbollah's weapons. This is it's a cabinet with a lot of competent people, and there have been some glimmers of hope here and there, but I would argue that generally it is underperforming. Because of lack of resource, because they're going against a very difficult timeline where, in a couple of months, it will all be about elections. And then, it's going to be, a very difficult time for them. So how much can they do in the process? I would say the second thing is and that should have been done, years ago, and perhaps there's some plan somewhere. Talking about defense reform in the country. what do we expect our military to do? Is it a glorified National Guard? Is it about external defense? And yeah, I mean, things are very different today than they were 20 years ago when Western assistance started coming because of our economic crisis, because, relatively speaking, the Lebanese army is in a more difficult place than it was, and so on. But what you said, Fadi, is about the president, the cabinet are not here to mediate between factions. They're here to set strategy. And I think that was, one big mistake when, it was suggested that, the president or others are going to pass around proposals and then everything is up for discussion. It's like, no, you have to actually present strategies that are debated in the public domain. And then you take your responsibility. It's not about, somehow believing that if you bring 10, 15, 20 people around the table, you're going to build a consensus over that. And I think that has been a problematic approach. But until the state decides that it has to formulate the defense and national security strategy, it's going to be very difficult to convince people that there is an alternative to Hezbollah and so on. But I would end by saying, look, Hezbollah, just miscalculated badly, and I'm being polite. I can think of other words here. But just because it is not a strategic player anymore vis-a-vis Israel does not mean, it is militarily debilitated when it comes to domestic dynamics in Lebanon. Okay, they can still do harm. We all should have in mind what happened in the past 20 years. It was quite brutal for a lot of the critics. But importantly, I think the way things are playing out, even Hezbollah's constituency, which was disappointed with the outcome of the war and so on, feel that they don't have, it's a moment of maximum danger. And unless we recognize this, unless we recognize that the talk among other leaders, as if, this is their moment and they could press hard without, just showing some empathy, some understanding of the anxieties of the other side, I think we're heading towards very, very difficult trade. And it's only the state that can play this role.
Well, today I'm a moderator, so I'm not allowed, but if you allow me, I did offer a formula that will be coming out shortly. So I'll share it with you all. That will be published soon. So it's a shameless plug. Thank you, Emile. That was very thoughtful. There are a few questions about Syria here. And I think one of the underlying themes is maybe you could both shed some light on where do you see the next steps happening regarding some form of deal between Syria and Israel, and where Lebanon may fit in all of this? Maybe, Greg, we can try this time with you.
Sure. So first, I saw there was one of these Syria questions in the chat was about this I-24 report about Tripoli apparently being. We asked Tom Barak about this earlier this week on Tuesday. He said it's not true. He said that hasn't been discussed. He said Ahmed Shara can sort of barely control his own country at this point. He's trying to figure out, how do you add an extra day of water or an extra day of power? In Damascus, he is certainly not in a position to ask for land in Lebanon. No one is talking about taking over Tripoli or parts of the Ba'a being handed over to Syria. He said that's not under consideration, and I tend to believe him on this. I think this was a very bizarre report from an Israeli outlet that is not often reliable. So I wouldn't place too much stock in that. I think on the question of where things are going between Syria and Israel, I think very, very likely that there will be a non-aggression pact, that there will be an update of the 1974 agreement between Syria and Israel, sort of guaranteeing that the two parties will not go to war for each other. I think they are going to stop somewhere rather short of Syria joining the Abraham Accords and a Syrian embassy opening in Tel Aviv. And I think some of this talk in Washington about how everyone in the Arab world is about to normalize relations with Israel is wishful thinking on the American part. I don't think Syria is prepared to go that far. I think Ahmed Sharaa would obviously worry about the political implications of doing that. I'm just not sure there's popular support for it. But I do think there is popular support for an agreement that would end this state of conflict between Syria and Israel. What that means, though, I mean, what does Syria get out of that agreement? Obviously, the most immediate thing that they get is they would probably get an end to Israeli strikes on their territory. They would probably get an Israeli withdrawal from the territory that Israel has occupied post-December, post-fall of Assad. When it comes to the Golan, I mean, there are my understanding is that there are various proposals being circulated. Maybe Israel would hand over some token amount of territory in the Golan, sort of very far north of it, as a gesture to the Syrians. Maybe they could have an agreement in which Israel kind of hands back the territory, but it's then immediately leased back to Israel so that Israelis can remain on that land. There are all of these proposals floating around. I tend to think that Syria is going to have to make a very large concession when it comes to the Golan. I tend to think that they are not going to get even a sort of token amount of territory back. So it's still being negotiated. But I think, again, what we're sort of likely to see in the short term is just a non-aggression pact that sees a return to the way things were before December, to the lines as they were before December.
Wonderful. You know, I'm going to be plugging so many different people's articles here because I see a question here. Can the May 1983 sort of agreement between Israel and Lebanon become the framework for some sort of potential agreement between Israel and Lebanon? And certainly those interested, just read an article in Arab News by Nadim Shahada that proposes this. So I wonder, do you see that as a potential way the Lebanese government can claim ownership over this question? Maybe Emile?
I find it hard to think that this is going to be the way it's going to happen. And I'm not even sure it's the desirable way either. I mean, you know, this is a very different kind of Israel than the 80s Israel. We should not underestimate not just the Arab but the Lebanese how Lebanese perceptions and Arab perception on Israel have soured. I mean, you know, every polling we see across communities, you know, one can find you know, satisfaction that Hezbollah was weakened without, you know, feeling that they have to rush into some kind of agreement with Israel. And the issues with Lebanon are complex. It's about border. Okay, the border issues are actually relatively easy, but it's things like water, it's Palestinian refugees, it's the kind of security guarantees. You know, what about, you know, would an agreement, for instance, force the Lebanese to relinquish some types of weaponry or deployment? I mean, you know, like it is going to be complex, and I don't see a rush towards peace and normalization with Israel at the moment. I don't think that's the direction we're going toward. And you know what Gregg said, you know, a non-aggression pact. Even that, you know, there are questions about what it would mean. Does it give Israel freedom of action? Does it limit the Syrian state reach into the south? Only certain units from a certain ministry or units are vetted, or do they have to, you know, before going to some village close to the border with Israel, they have to call someone in Israel and say, hey, we're showing up. You know, these things are quite complex. We theoretically can talk about this and think that something is in the making. The operational details are going to be very, very complex, and they're going to set the security structure. I also think that from a regional perspective, we're not going to have a big move before you know, some of the bigger actors, especially Saudi Arabia, take a stand on these things. I mean, you know, the idea that Lebanon is going to rush towards a peace agreement with Israel. I mean, not necessarily rush, but before Saudi Arabia has decided what's in its interest, for me, feels a bit Pollyannish. I don't know if Gregg agrees with that, but the sequencing also matters here. And you can certainly see the Lebanese basically saying, you know, we'll sign something if the Saudis are on board. You know, our guarantee in a way is this one. So I don't see like purely bilateral arrangements happening with some of the weaker players, i.e. Lebanon and Syria.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, it gives us an opportunity to clarify. I see a question here, something we've all, you know, sort of assumed. How would you both, and again, we have 15 minutes left, so I appreciate, you know, some brevity here. How would you say, what is the operational definition of Hezbollah's disarmament? And I'm going to sort of amend the question from a Lebanese state's perspective and the other from Israel's perspective. You know, to your point, what would satisfy that threshold?
There's a famous American Supreme Court decision about pornography where Justice Potter Stewart is trying to define pornography, and he defines it as "I'll know it when I see it." I think that is the definition of disarmament. I mean, you ask people both in Lebanon and in Israel and in Washington, what does that mean in operational terms? And you get very vague answers or no answers at all. I think there's a difference, right? I think from an Israeli perspective, what does disarmament mean? It doesn't mean that every single rifle or every single RPG or anti-tank missile has to be confiscated from Hezbollah's arsenal. It means that the group must no longer have the sort of arsenal that poses a strategic threat to Israel. There must be no risk of an October 7th style attack across the border, which means there cannot be any bunkers, tunnels, underground positions, fortified positions in the southern part of Lebanon. It means certain groups of sophisticated, precision-guided missiles, things like that. Hezbollah can no longer have those things. But if it retains some light arms, that is, from an Israeli perspective, not a big deal as far as disarmament goes. From a Lebanese perspective, I think there's more reason to be concerned about that, right? Because if they maintain light arms, they can't necessarily use those to fight against Israel. They can use those domestically, as they have done in the past. So I think there is a real divergence there in what would qualify as adequate disarmament. But how you get to, from the Lebanese perspective, if you want it to be completely disarmed, how you get to that point, how you sort of operationally, practically do that, I'm just not sure how you do.
Thank you. And as we near the end of our conversation, Emile, I want to, split the questions up. You gave us such a great breakdown of the complexities shaping U.S. policy to Lebanon, the personal, the institutional sort of variables that affect it. You'll forgive me for a very simple question, but I think it's an important one. After what you heard of Ambassador Barak's sort of, whether it's the follow-up interview or his comments to the Lebanese people, what's your reading? Is it a positive message? Is it a negative message? And again, as difficult as it is, what can we look for, those of us in the audience? What are some signs we can look for about Washington's degree of confidence in the Lebanese government in the next 6 months?
I mean, look, there's the message and the messenger. A lot of what was said makes sense. It could have been said by someone else. I think there is an agreement among many, not all Lebanese, that a lot of things that Tom Barak has said need to happen. What sequence, by which actor, and so on. That's up for discussion. The key point is first, you have to differentiate between the responsibility that the Lebanese have towards Lebanon and themselves, And I would argue that we don't necessarily meet those responsibilities most of the time. But it's also whether this America, this Trump administration, can deliver its end of the bargain, will actually accompany a process, is thinking in this like as part of a regional stabilization integration strategy that includes, like, you can't go and say Lebanon has to be stabilized and do all these things and so on, which, by the way, would be good for Lebanon. But that Palestinian issue, we don't want to talk about it. Gaza exists in a different planet altogether. Like, this is the problem that we're facing with, right? Is that we can wish all the good things you want for Lebanon, but if there's not a broader context of stabilization that requires difficult political concessions by everyone, by the Israelis, by the Palestinians, by the Lebanese, and so on, it's very difficult to get on board like with enthusiasm with the agenda. Now, that being said, I think the current government is trying. It's facing significant headwinds. It made mistakes. It set high expectations. High expectations are never met in this part of the world. But fundamentally, if they drop the issue of financial economic reform or sovereignty, they will have cut both legs they have. I mean, there's no reason, just because they're nice and competent professionals and on paper they look great and in person they're very effective, you won't have trust in that. So they're going to have to carry that agenda, not until September when the election season starts, but until May, right? Otherwise, Lebanon is completely exposed to regional dynamics, but also completely exposed to a renewal of Israeli attacks, and that's the big problem we're facing, right? That we don't control the clock, and we don't control or we have very little influence on the priorities of the main players. So we should do the right thing because it's the right thing, not because we're answering a specific American demand. I would say, when it comes to Hezbollah, I think internally they're having a big debate about whether it is really they cannot reconstitute themselves strategically. Let's be honest. In the foreseeable future, 5-10 years, these guys have no chance of rebuilding a force, possibly more, that is strategically significant. The question is, and one of your questions, one of the participants' question was, do they trade that military power for political power? And that opens another kind of worms for the Lebanese system, right? Which is, political reform beyond that. If you're in Hezbollah and you want to, test the Lebanese, that's what you would put on the table right now. At the same time, if you do so, you will reveal your complete weakness.
I mean, thank you, Emile. Powerful words. As we wrap up, we have certainly a very thoughtful audience, as you both pointed out. And, we've tried to address most of the questions, but a common theme I see in all these questions is a willingness to propose solutions. And I guess I want to end our conversation by asking you both, in just a few sentences, if you had one piece of advice at this critical moment for Lebanon, what would you share to Lebanon's new leadership and government in this moment? Just one piece of advice. And what's one thing you'd want to see them do differently? Maybe we could start with you, Gregg, and then end with you, Emile.
I think one thing that I have been asking over the past week, as I've been in Beirut doing meetings, one thing that I've been asking everyone is, what happens if Lebanon moves on Hezbollah, moves on the security issue, on sovereignty and the authority of the state, but doesn't move on the economic reforms? What if the old politics of delay that have obstructed economic reform since the crisis began in 2019, what if they prevail? What happens next? And, I think there's always this hope here, right, that miracles will happen, that the oil and gas discoveries will turn Lebanon into Dubai on the Mediterranean, or, as Emile said before, that the fall of Assad would unlock reconstruction money flowing through Lebanon, or that peace with Israel would somehow unlock a flood of aid and fix the economy. And the response that I get from foreign diplomats, from American officials, from IMF officials is that that's not going to happen, that Lebanon still has to move on these domestic economic reforms if it wants to unlock aid, if it wants to unlock. I mean, Barak was very clear. He said there are a few projects that the Saudis and Qataris will do in the south, but broadly, no one is interested in helping Lebanon unless Lebanon helps itself. And he meant on the economic front. So if there is no progress on that, if the belief is that just, exerting the authority of the state south of the Litani is going to be sufficient to solve Lebanon's economic problems, to dig it out of the very deep hole that it's in, I think if you believe that, you're going to be disappointed. That economic reform is still every bit as important as it was.
Thanks, Greg. And Emile?
I mean, let me address the other pillar here. I mean, I think that this government has every interest in announcing the launch of a internal, not a national consultation on a future national defense strategy, and have it published before the election, and then have the various political players position themselves accordingly on this one, without but and ifs and so on. It's say, we really need to start talking about that hard issue. And by the way, it goes from the local policing all the way to how you think about your defense relationships and so on. The idea, I mean, you remember these endless meetings between all these leaders. Where was it, at some hotel in the past? You got 15, 20 people pretending to talk about the hard issues, knowing that these were endless consultation with no point. I think the government should just take responsibility and publish, a commission and publish its own national security strategy. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you both. Powerful words, powerful recommendations, thoughtful discussion. I appreciate your time and your candor. And thank you again, Kuluna Irada, for hosting us. And thank you to our audience for your engagement. I will remind everyone this will be recorded, so you can sort of revisit anything or highlight anything that you appreciated in today's discussion. Thank you all for your time.